Hello friends, Lee C. Camp here. You're listening to our unabridged episode with Marisa Franco. Marisa is the New York Times best-selling author of the book Platonic, How the Science of Attachment Can Help You Make and Keep Friends. I started some years ago telling my ethics students that folks like Aristotle and Plato and Aquinas saw friendship as one of the most fundamental practices in the formation of a moral life. It's a bit of a surprise to them. I grew up with the kind of legalistic notion that the preacher would sometimes citing the Apostle Paul saying, evil companions corrupt good morals, and there's certainly something to that, that indeed ill choices in our friends can indeed corrupt a life. But on the other hand, there's a sort of constructive way of looking at the practice of friendship and realizing it may be among the most important choices one makes about the shape of one's life. And there's lots to be said about friendship, but today Marisa Franco is looking at friendship from a psychological perspective, especially how our early experiences can impact the way we avoid, or if not avoid, the way we may anxiously approach relationships and thus friendship. And then looking at various ways forward in the way that we can cultivate friendships. This raises as well the episode that we did a couple of years ago with professors Robert Waldinger and Mark Schultz, who are the director and co-director of the Harvard Study on Human Happiness, which is the longest running history ever done on human happiness. And that after many, many decades, I think it's about 80 years, they determined that the number one variable on happiness was that of the extent to which one has what they called warm relationships. So there's, again, lots to be said about friendship, lots to be said about relationships, but Marisa makes a significant contribution to our understanding and the kind of practical, very concrete, specific ways we can make steps forward in cultivating our own friendships. I hope you find this helpful, and more, I hope you practice it and continue to look for ways that you can, as I like to say, that I picked up from somebody else, to make common wisdom common practice. Enjoy. Our guest today is psychologist, TED speaker, and New York Times bestselling author, Dr. Marisa G. Franco. Dr. Franco is a professor at the University of Maryland, writes about friendship for Psychology Today, and has been a featured connection expert for major publications like the New York Times, The Telegraph, and Vice. Today we're discussing her New York Times bestseller, Platonic, How the Science of Attachment Can Help You Make and Keep Friends. Welcome, Marisa.
Thanks so much for having me. Hi.
Yeah. Hi, good to have you with us. I love your new book and find it immensely helpful and grateful for the work that you've done. So what would give an academic the sort of impetus to spend as much time and research as you have on the question of friendship?
Yeah, well, it was definitely me search. I went through some breakups a decade ago, and I felt really bad about them. And I ended up deciding to start this wellness group with my friends where we met up and practiced wellness, meditation, cooking, yoga. And I found it really transformative. And it made me reflect on some of the assumptions I had that made me take breakups so hard, which is romantic love is the only love that can make me complete. I'm not worthy unless I have a romantic partner. And I just looked around and I was like, well, why doesn't this love matter? Why do we treat it as so trivial? And I kind of just got really interested in the topic of friendship, and eventually was like, I really want a book to exist that gets into the science, that shows friendship as the dignified relationship that I see it, that gives people evidence-based advice on navigating friendships. And eventually I was like, okay, I guess I'll be the one to write it.
So one of the things I appreciate about what you're making the case for is going back to somebody like Aristotle, who argued that friendship was kind of the most fundamental category for our formation as human beings. And that, as you say, it was not seen with the Greek philosophers as a kind of secondary concern, but a primary commitment. And as I've talked about friendship through the years with my students, I'm also pushing them to kind of think, look at your friendships, rightfully understood and rightfully practiced, might be the most formative thing in your life. And it seems to me that that's what you're arguing.
Yeah, I mean, Marsilio Ficino, the guy who created the term Platonic, he was like Italian Renaissance philosopher. He sort of said that like Platonic love is divine enough to transcend the physical. And so in some ways he saw it as the superior form of love because it wasn't physical. And I think when it comes to romantic love, it's beautiful, but without romantic love that includes friendship, sometimes we rely on chemistry rather than true compatibility.
Mm.
And I think sometimes we tend to be more clear-eyed about compatibility when we're thinking of people as friends, and that hopefully even if we are looking for romance, that we also consider that we should find someone we'd also be really good friends with.
Mm. You while the ancients obviously knew a lot about friendship, they couldn't have known all of the things that you alluded to a moment ago when you talked about in your work, you're wanting to point people to evidence-based advice on how to practice these things. So they couldn't have done all the kind of fascinating scientific, psychological, neuroscience kind of studies that have been done. So point us towards some of the most important findings with regard to the practice of friendship as to what it does for us and what it does to us from that kind of perspective.
Mm. Well, the most popularly cited statistic is that loneliness is as toxic for our bodies as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, which is wild because people will not smoke 15 cigarettes a day,
Yeah.
but they'll go lonely for long periods of time. And like the reason is like friendship makes us feel higher levels of oxytocin, which researchers also consider the fountain of youth as a hormone. And so the things that help us connect are also the things that keep us young. There's even research that when people are exposed to the common cold, they are, many times less likely to actually contract it when they feel very connected to others. So I think people could guess that like friendship does something for our mental health, which it definitely does. I mean, when you look at studies on very happy people, their most defining characteristic is not how spiritual they are, how much they exercise, all the things you'd expect. It is how connected they are. But there's also this very strong impact on our physical health as well, that our level of connection impacts.
What are the mechanisms behind that? I mean, why is that true?
Yeah, I mean, friendship really helps us regulate stress. Like, if, for example, there's a study that found that out of 106 factors that predict depressive symptoms, having someone to confide in is the number one preventer. And stress causes long-term wear and tear on our bodies. And like, there's an interesting study that when people evaluated how steep a hill was, they saw it as less steep when they were with a friend. So it's even before like the stress hits us, we're internalizing it differently. But then once the stress hits us, we're also metabolizing it better. And then also that hormone oxytocin that I mentioned.
The subtitle of your book points us towards attachment theory. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about that and what that has to do with friendship. So first, maybe just describe to us the field or the theory, attachment theory itself.
Yeah, so attachment theory is this idea that from our relationships with our early caregivers, we develop this template of how other people will treat us that becomes very self-fulfilling. So for people that were had loving, caring, attentive caregivers, they become securely attached. They tend to be comfortable being vulnerable, assume things will go right, really feel rewarded by connection, are comfortable taking the risks that come with connection, initiating, being vulnerable, sharing love and affection. But then you have people that their caregivers were inconsistent. They were there sometimes, but not others. They kind of had to earn the love of their caregivers. Maybe their caregivers were very distractive, wrapped up in their own anxieties. These people end up being anxiously attached. And they always think they're going to be rejected or abandoned by other people. They are preoccupied with their relationships. Like if something goes wrong, it sort of keeps them up at night. Research finds that when they're rejected, their amygdala that is associated with stress lights up more brightly than people of other attachment styles. So they're very affected by relationship issues. And it means that they often are putting a lot of effort in their relationships, but not getting any rewards because they always think people are rejecting me. And then they're sort of pulling away or acting out or giving up on friendships that securely attached people would try to work through. But then you have avoidantly attached people, and their caregivers were sort of people that were like, I'll give you shelter, I'll give you food, but emotionally neglectful. Like, I don't care to know your internal world. Sort of like kids should be, what is the phrase? Like seen but not heard.
Seen but not heard, yeah.
Exactly. So these avoidantly attached people fear if I get close to you, you're going to completely reject me. I can't trust
Mm.
people. And so these avoidantly attached people, they're sort of low effort, low reward. They're either loners, they're not putting in effort, everyone has to reach out to them, struggle a lot with being vulnerable, very rarely vulnerable. They feel like a black box, an enigma. People feel like they don't really know them. And they're very uncomfortable doing the sort of things that nurture connection, like showing love or being generous. Cause again, they just think they can't trust anyone. And if they are vulnerable or affectionate, that just opens them up more to being harmed.
Mm. So you said these early experiences set us up with a template that becomes self-fulfilling. So just tell us more about the self-fulfilling piece of that.
Yeah. So if we kind of walk through this, the life of someone anxiously attached, let's say like you meet a new friend and it seems like you're really hitting it off and you're texting a little and they kind of fall off a little. If you're anxiously attached, that'll make you very anxious. Maybe the friend will eventually come around and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I missed you. I was really busy." And you might assume, "Oh, they're just saying that. They don't actually like me. They're not actually invested in me." And so you'll sort of pull away. Whereas someone who's more secure would be like, "Oh yeah, like you're busy. Like, cool. I'm glad you got back around to it. Like, I'd still love to find a time to hang out, right?" Versus someone who is avoidant, who might not even make that initial offer to like, let's keep in touch, let's exchange text messages because they just sort of distrust people. So there's this way that our beliefs about others just recreate themselves. They force us to act in ways that are then going to confirm those beliefs. And it's also like, even at the level of our nervous system, if people are disconfirming our beliefs, but for us, right, it still feels like they're confirming it. Like for me, for the parts of me that'll be anxiously attacked, I get really anxious about like bringing up a problem or a concern. And if a friend's like, "Thank you that you told me, like, I appreciate it." I'm like, "Oh no, they're just saying that." Like really, they're upset with me and they don't want to be my friend. And that's what still feels real for me, even though the reality is otherwise. And so, this is how like memory works. It just continues to impose itself onto how we're perceiving reality now. And we really don't, at like the sort of nervous system embodied internal level, perceive that our social reality is actually really different than what our bodies are telling us.
But I suppose the whole premise of your book is that we're not permanently imprisoned by these early attachment experiences. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I feel like it's really important to learn about attachment theory, because before I knew about it, it was like, "Oh, is it just that all relationships are fragile, or is it just that you can't trust anyone and you have no power because you think that the issue's only outside of you?" But when you realize, oh, there are certain behaviors that I'm doing that are then making this outcome that I fear actually more likely, then you can change your behaviors,
Mm.
right? Like maybe the avoidantly attached person can reach out, or the anxiously attached person can bring up an issue instead of like withdrawing because they don't want to seem like too much. Like you can change your behaviors and make your relationships more sustainable. So I hope that I share attachment theory not from a place of blame, but from a place of greater illumination that gives us the offering of engaging in the behaviors that are going to get us the relationships that we want.
Yeah. So if you don't mind me asking, as you learned more about attachment theory, where did you find yourself? Secure, anxious, or avoidant?
When I initially learned about attachment theory, I was sort of like a mix of secure and anxious. And then my next book is on the science of feeling secure.
Uh-huh.
So then I think I went into this place of like, how do I act secure? Which helps, right? Because then people are responding to you in a more secure way when you're able to like bring up problems in a level-headed way. But this is my next book now. And I think Platonic gives us all the tips of like, okay, like how to do the secure thing that makes it more likely that people are going to respond well. But my book now is really on how do we do the deep internal work so that we fundamentally feel secure? Like the communication isn't about like kind of overriding how we feel and still coming off as secure, but we're actually connected to how we feel and we feel secure within.
It is fascinating. I mean, I think certainly I was just thinking about myself, and I think probably 10 years ago, I would have primarily seen myself in the anxious attachment category. And then I've worked a lot on myself in the last 10 years, and I'm much more in the secure place. But even like today, I had a telephone call that I needed to make to a family member. And it was like I was right back as a 12-year-old, navigating this with this family member. And I had to remind myself, Lee, you're not a 12-year-old anymore.
Yeah.
You don't have to carry the feelings that you had as a 12-year-old with regard to this relationship. And so it is fascinating the way that stuff can kind of stick with us, even though we've done a lot of work with that and a lot of work on it. So part 2 then of your book, practices of friendship. And I guess first I would just like to say, since this is arising out of this conversation about attachment theory, it seems to me that to do most of these practices, that we'll have time to talk about a number of them, does require first this sort of initial courage to step into a place that might be uncomfortable for either the anxious person or the avoidant person. Is that fair?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Real uncomfortable. Yes.
Yeah. A sort of willingness to do some hard things as a sort of meta habit that can get us into. And that's one of the things I find so interesting about so many of our guests that we have, is that, going back to the Aristotle's cardinal virtues, it's like apart from courage, prudence, temperance, and justice, then we really can't make much progress on many of the other kind of practices that we want to be in our life. So, but certainly courage stood out to me as central to the ones that you're pointing us to. So let's talk about some of these. Taking initiative, first simply just deciding to initiate some.
Yes. Okay. So a lot of people think friendship should just happen organically. In adulthood, it doesn't. People that think that way are actually lonelier years later, because when you think that, you don't make an effort. You don't volunteer. You don't show up at that place of worship. It's a very self-sabotaging belief. And so the first thing that I tell people is you're going to have to try. You're going to have to reach out to people. Hey, I really enjoyed talking to you. Would you be open to connecting? Now, people are very afraid of rejection, particularly our insecure attachment styles. But I like to tell people about research on something called the liking gap. This finding that when strangers interact and they're asked how much they like each other, they underestimate how liked they are. And so we are liked by others more than we think. So that gives me like my tip for initiating is to try to assume that people are going to like you. I know that we all have these insecure parts that tell us otherwise, but like those insecurities aren't all of us. We can leave space beyond them to speak back, just like in your beautiful example, and say like, what if this goes right? Or I'm okay. Or like, I'll be okay no matter what happens. Or, what if this ends up being really enjoyable? What if I make a great friend? And this is based off of research on something called the acceptance prophecy. This finding that when researchers told people that they would be liked, they said, we did analysis based on your personality profile. You're going to go interact with this person. They're going to like you. And that wasn't true. They were deceiving the participants. But when people thought that way, they became friendlier and warmer and more open. Whereas we don't always realize, but when we fear rejection, we constantly reject people, like we're closing our arms, we're kind of cold, we're sitting in the corner. I see my Gen Z students, they have their AirPods in their ears when they're like scared of people. And that becomes self-fulfilling because if we're rejecting people, they're not going to be comfortable engaging with us.
Yeah. So give us a few more tips on ways we might take initiative.
Yeah. So the first tip I have is to reconnect with people from your past, because research shows that you have more trust than you do new people. Also, that they're more likely to want to hear from you than you think, similar to the research on the liking gap. So you can kind of look for people that you spoke to maybe a year ago in your text messages and say, who do I want to reach out to? The second tip that I have is to join something repeated over time. And that capitalizes on something called the mere exposure effect, which is this finding that when people are familiar to us, we like them more. And so, for example, when researchers planted women into a psychology lecture, at the end of the semester, none of them remembered those women, but they liked the woman who showed up for the most classes 20% more than the woman that didn't show up for any. And so if you can join something, like sometimes people want to make friends, they go to like a single happy hour. I tell them, join that board of the professional development, join, the soccer league, the improv class, the language workshop, so that you can capitalize on your exposure. And also know that at the beginning, it's going to be uncomfortable, right? The problem is a lot of the times we think it's uncomfortable, so I shouldn't go back. This isn't right for me, rather than understanding the science, which is that's actually just part of the process of connecting. We're weary when we're unfamiliar. We get more familiar. We get more comfortable. And the other thing I would say is to, once you do that, to try to repot your relationships. That's a term from Ryan Hubbard. He has this thing called the Kite String Project to foster connection, but it's basically varying the settings in which you interact. So if you meet in volleyball or you meet in, ethics class, right? Asking that person like, hey, I really enjoyed talking to you. Like, would you be open to coming over for dinner sometime or like going for a walk sometime? And reaching out to initiate. And again, there's research on this too, that when people initiate, they underestimate how much people enjoy receiving that act of initiation.
Yeah. What's like on the liking gap? Is the gap between how much we think other people are going to like us and the higher liking that they typically might have for us? What's the source of that, you think?
I think our brains are wired for safety and connection, but when the two come in conflict with each other, our brains choose safety. So if there's something scary that might benefit us, often we teeter towards being more cautious rather than recognizing the rewards inherent in those acts. And our brain definitely overblows social threat, like the chance of social threat. And so, for example, like I teach classes on how to make friends at the University of Maryland. I get students to talk to strangers 5 times based off of research from Gillian Sandstrom that finds that while we think that when talking to strangers about 40% of the time they'll be open to talking to us, it actually ends up being 90% of the time. And once those students get that experience, it challenges the assumptions inherent in some of their attachment styles. It shows them that things are a lot less scary than they think. But if you never try it, you never put yourself out there, then you're going to be stuck in the sort of negative, cautious predictions that a lot of our brains tend to have.
So it's a sort of evolutionarily developed tendency simply to avoid danger, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the weird thing about loneliness, Lee. Like, we think of loneliness as a desire for connection, but it often manifests as a desire to escape threat. And so lonely people are more likely to withdraw from people, more likely to perceive others as being hostile when they're not, more likely to take things personally, more likely to respond vengefully. Because when you're lonely, everything, how you perceive your world is completely different. Everything becomes more threatening. And from an evolutionary perspective, if you're lonely, you're separate from your tribe. You have to be on high alert. But now I think when we're lonely, it gets really difficult to get out of because while we want social connection, we're so much more threatened by it than we are when we feel connected, right? Like sometimes it'd be like, I don't want to see anyone. I don't want to hang out when I've spent the day alone, but I'll have like one good conversation and be like, oh, actually, like that was kind of nice. I kind of needed that little.
What's your favorite tip for talking to strangers?
Oh, well, I really like the insight and the question method. I don't remember who came up with this. It wasn't me, but it's sort of like you share something about your shared environment and then ask a follow-up question like, oh, it's a little like gloomy out today. Like, how do you like the winter weather? Or, oh, the holidays are coming up. Have you gotten any gifts? Or what's your favorite gift to receive? And I think people put so much pressure on themselves to find the perfect thing to say. But as Nicholas Epley, one researcher says, is like, while nobody waves, everyone waves back. So as long as you break the seal, that's all that you need to do. You don't need to find the perfect line. You just need to break the seal and offer the opportunity to engage.
So after taking initiative, you have expressing vulnerability, which I think probably would immediately begin to frighten a lot of folks. But so talk to us about that one.
Everything I write about is that's the MO of a friendship expert, I guess. Ironically. Yes. So expressing vulnerability, I think a lot of us think that my vulnerability will burden people. People will judge me, see me as weak. People want to be friends with someone that's perfect. But this is just not what we see in the research at all. We see that people that disclose more intimately about themselves are liked more, that we like people we disclose to, so it creates a reinforcing cycle, that people are more likely to be vulnerable with us, that when we think about the impact of our vulnerability, we often overblow the likelihood of judgment and underestimate how likely it is that people are going to perceive us as honest and as more authentic. We think of it as a burden, but often it's a form of flattery when we tell someone something vulnerable because it indicates that we trust them. And anything that you do to make people feel like you like them is going to make them more likely to like you. That's called the theory of inferred attraction. And so vulnerability can really create connection. Now, if you have people out there who are very therapized and psychologists, they will often do this sort of packaged vulnerability. Well, they'll say something that sounds vulnerable, like, even I go to therapy can sound vulnerable, but it doesn't feel vulnerable for them in their own body from their unique subjective experience. And the issue with that is that I think vulnerability is risk gone right. And if it doesn't feel like a risk, it's not going to make you feel closer to the person, right? And so I, in that chapter, encourage us to actually think about what's actually vulnerable for me uniquely. Like maybe it's asking for support. Maybe it's bringing up an issue or a problem that you have and try to bring more of that to your relationships.
There's also, I have occasionally, before I go to that, let me back up. Yeah, I very much have found in continuity with what you've said, this sort of way in which if someone's authentically vulnerable with me, there's just an immediate kind of opening of trust there. And I think I remember as I was flashing back to being a college student, undergrad, and I had a mentor who was like the vice president of our university. And because of some circumstances, I got in this great relationship with him where we would meet once a week. And I was always amazed that he would tell me certain things about himself that I thought, I can't believe he's telling me that. But it gave me this sort of immediate desire to be trustworthy with him and to hold these things very carefully, and this sort of deep connection that was built because of that. And I think that was kind of one of the first instances where I found the way vulnerability can build that kind of trust that I just find so fascinating.
Yeah.
And of course, as you say in your chapter on this, we fear vulnerability because of the shame, I suppose, right? And the fear of rejection that comes with that. So how might folks navigate then some of that shame or fear of rejection to kind of step into a place like this?
One thing I suggest is to scaffold your vulnerability, which means that if you have something vulnerable, share it first with someone that you find the most trustworthy. And maybe that's your therapist, your spouse, your best friend. And then you can share it with the person that's more of a wild card, because after you receive that initial affirmation, it feels a little less vulnerable when you're sharing it with the next person. The issue really, when it comes to vulnerability, is there are times that it goes wrong. I wouldn't say that it's most of the time, but we will generalize those times. So we think that it's every time. And I think if you initially confide in someone that does make you feel good when you're vulnerable, then you know not to generalize that vulnerability is bad, but just this person wasn't a fit for my vulnerability. And I do encourage people to be discerning, which means find someone who's willing to be vulnerable with you, who just gives even your nervous system a feeling of safety and groundedness when you're with them, who doesn't disclose things about other people to you that seem like they should be held in confidence. Looking for some of those green flags before just word vomiting your vulnerability.
Yeah. I have tended to approach vulnerability with new friends as a sort of slow disclosure process, right? That there's vulnerability and then there's vulnerability, right? And trying to be wise about discerning who can handle what level of vulnerability seems crucial in this process.
Yep.
I've also discovered on occasion that there seems to be a sort of performative vulnerability that maybe is a desire to get to a deep friendship too quickly, or to try to manipulate us into a kind of close friendship? Talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, I think you're referring to something like oversharing. And it's hard to determine what oversharing is, right? Because someone who's avoidantly attached, kind of like any act of vulnerability, will feel like oversharing with them. So I kind of define it as like based in your own intentions. And when we're oversharing, it's often because we're testing the other person to see if they'll like us, even despite our flaws.
Mm,
And so it doesn't come from a background of, I feel safe, so I share with you. It's actually, I feel unsafe, so I share
mm,
with you to try to kind of capture you and create you and mold you into a safe person. And so I think to determine whether our vulnerability is a little bit manipulative or perhaps not a good idea for us and like our own self protection is like understanding our intentions. Like, is it coming from anxiety? Is it coming from fear? Is it coming from this person might abandon me, so I'm going to share something really deep? So, that'll test if they'll stick around. Or is it coming from, oh, I feel like comfortable with you. I feel our connection. I feel like there's trust. And so, as a reflection of that, I'm going to be vulnerable.
mm. Which relates, I guess, to your next chapter on authenticity, the pursuit of authenticity. So how would you encourage us to think about that?
Yeah. So authenticity was hard to define because a lot of people are like, just be your true self. And I'm like, what the heck is that? So I came to define it as who we are without our defense mechanisms. And so our defense mechanisms are like, Eh, I feel jealous of you, so I put you down instead of saying, "Oh, yeah, like I'm just struggling with a little bit of jealousy because like this has been going on in my life."
Mm,
You're kind of trying to obscure the true feeling instead of communicate the true feeling. And so, inauthenticity can look like I'm going to withdraw from this person because I don't think they like me, instead of like, oh, hey, like I really enjoyed our connection. I'm just wondering like how you're feeling about it, right? That being a more authentic act. Or, I think for a lot of my students, it's like, I'm going to come off too strong. So I'm going to seem chill and aloof, right? But if you actually are excited about the person, like that's where you are with your authenticity, right? And so it's trying to avoid those defense mechanisms because I think, and there's research that finds that when we act authentically, we're more resilient. What I think is happening is that in an act of authenticity, you are validating that I matter, that my feelings and my reality matters enough to not try to obscure it with these defense mechanisms. And in that act, we become more resilient for the threats that we fear. And so instead of just trying to brace and act weird, we can just try to be more authentic. And there's interesting research with people that have social anxiety who tend to engage in these types of safety behaviors to avoid rejection. Like they'll speak really fast
mm,
because they think the other person isn't interested, or they'll ramble, or they'll become completely quiet because they think what they have to say is unimportant. When they're told to drop those safety behaviors, they're liked more because they're more present. They are more engaged. And so while we think these defense mechanisms might manage rejection, what they're actually doing is creating disconnection and making rejection more likely.
mm. I mean, repeatedly, we keep seeing the way in which one is going to have to exercise courage, as we said a minute ago. And so I'm imagining someone who finds themselves listening to what you just said, and they're just overcome with anxiety or overcome with fear about practicing the vulnerability or practicing taking an initiative or practicing this authenticity that you just pointed to. So what sort of wisdom, advice would you give to somebody who's just saying, I just can't do that stuff. I'm too caught up. I'm too trapped by my earlier life experiences, and I just don't know how to get out of this.
Yeah. Well, I would say, like, thank you for being honest. It's valid that it's hard. It's really valid that it's scary. Um, I think part of the ways that like we find more security amidst all of these risks is to try to find a tether or anchor within ourselves too. I think Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion, which is like, how would you speak to a friend if they
Yeah.
came to you with these issues? Can you speak to yourself internally like that? Like, no, you're actually really great and you have so much to give to people and it's okay to be scared. We're all scared, but that doesn't mean that things are going to turn out as bad as you fear and you only know if you do it, right? And so um trying to offer ourselves that compassion that makes us more ready to engage in these things that we're afraid of. Like when you look at the research on loneliness and you see who stays lonely versus who gets out of it, it's the people that interpret their loneliness as reflecting that something's wrong with them and they're deficient and people just don't like them, or that something's wrong with everyone else and you can't trust people and people are
Mm.
just bad. Those are the people that stay lonely. But the people that say, okay, like this is something I'm going through, but there's hope that things could be better. There's possibility, like there have been times where I've connected well with people in my life even if I'm struggling right now, there are people that like me. Those people that, they have this hope, they don't have this rigid view of themselves or other people. They're just a lot more likely to get out of it. And so I would just say, like, have humility over your critical voice, right? It may
Mm.
seem very true, but there's possibilities beyond it. And in fact, I think there's a part within you that still knows that, even while you have your insecurities.
Mm. So another practice you point to is harmonizing anger, which again, with I guess both the avoidant and the anxious type, the whole notion of anger in relationships can again stir up this sort of fear. But how would you help us think through how to frame and employ anger as something that can engender intimacy?
Well, I was really bad at bringing up anger. This chapter was the biggest growth area for me. Um, and for a lot of people, like people are a
Yeah.
lot less likely to bring up their misgivings with a friend than a romantic partner. But imagine a romantic partnership where you never brought up any issues. Like what? It wouldn't be sustainable. And intimacy is intimacy. Like if you have to work through issues with your romantic partner, you're gonna have to work through them with your close friends. Like that's just part of intimacy is rupture. So first normalizing that. And I started to read research that when you have conflict in an empathic way, where you're not attacking or blaming people, it's actually linked to having a deeper, more intimate relationship. That people that are really good at friendship, they tend to bring things up more than people that aren't as good as friendship
Mm.
and just sort of withdraw. Seeing in my own life that I felt like I should get over the anger without burdening the other person, but it was actually just leading me to withdraw from the other person without even giving them a chance to like express their side. So that was what I needed, kind of like seeing this reality beyond my own fears to be able to bring up issues with a friend. And I guess when I was more anxiously attached, I thought if I bring this up, people are going to abandon me. And then it would sort of, I wouldn't bring it up, and then I would blow up or be like particularly angry. And then they would pull away. And what I didn't realize is it wasn't because I brought things up, it's because I was unkind. And
Mm.
unkindness harms relationships, whether it's in conflict or not. And so, some strategies that I suggest is first framing the conversation, which is reassuring the person that you want to have this conversation because you love them. Like, hey, there's just been some things on my mind. I just don't want them to get in the way of our friendship because you're really important to me. Using I statements. I felt hurt when this happened instead of attacking you. You're a bad friend. You really disappointed me. Making it collaborative, asking the other person, yeah, like, I'm just curious. Like, I know that this is like my perception of things, but like, what was your reality? Like, what contributed to this issue on your end? And what do we do going forward? And I think some of us might think of like conflict as like, being raw, like saying the first thing that's on our mind, but that's often coming from an inauthentic place. It's coming from our most triggered self that just wants to blame, protect us against our
Yeah.
own shame, our own discomfort. And so it's actually hard, I think, to not do those things. You have to be very present with yourself. And you shouldn't just be saying the first thing that comes to mind when it comes to conflict. Because there's just been these junctures in my friendships where I've seen that if we did the conflict well, it would forever bring us closer. But if we did it poorly, it might forever distance us. So it's
Hmm.
just a really critical time to try to communicate very well in ways that are loving towards yourself and the other person.
What allowed you to begin to articulate your own anger?
It was literally those research studies where I was like, oh, I guess I'm missing out.
Mm.
I thought I was doing it right, but this research is telling me that my relationships are inferior if I'm not bringing up issues. And what it was interesting because when I brought up an issue with my best friend, I had a few that I hadn't brought up in a while, which, that was probably hard for her to hear multiple issues at once. But one of them was, oh, I sent you my book chapter and I asked for your feedback and I didn't even get a response from you. And she explained, oh, I had actually emailed you back and I hadn't seen it. And how sad might have
Huh.
been that I would withdraw from her from a misconception that I had. And it was only through bringing it up that I was given that opportunity. And so I've kind of recognized that while I thought it was an act of kindness to not burden people or not, or get over it on my own, like it actually held people as guilty without even giving them a trial.
Mm.
And that's actually really mean to do to the people that
Yeah.
we love. I think people that we love would much rather be given the opportunity to kind of clear things up.
Yeah. Yet again, I mean, all of this points to the way in which friendship done well will require us to grow up as human beings and mature as
Yes.
human beings, won't it? Yeah. We
To be
can't do
led.
friendship well if we can't grow in the basics of what it means to be a human being.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I was also thinking about, I was also highly conflict avoidant when I was younger. And my wife, on the other hand, we laughed early on about the way in which, she never had an emotion that she didn't immediately voice. And I never had something that I was angry about that I didn't brood on for 2 weeks and then I might say something about it, And so, and so she would get so angry with me in our early years of our marriage because I would not argue with her. And she would sometimes, raise her voice and say, why won't you argue with me? And so for like 7 years, I just wouldn't argue. And then finally, all of this got bottled up. And then for the next 7 years, I would just blow up all the time. And so finally, I had to learn, I've got to figure out a way to learn these practices of articulating my emotions and articulating my feelings, or I just can't live well and I can't do very well. So I find all of that you shared there very helpful.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's underneath that is like, we've got to find a way to trust that people love us, right? And if someone loves you, they don't want you to be brooding for a long time. Like they don't want to hurt you. They want to know how to treat you better. And it's so hard to trust that people love us, right? But when we don't, it's kind of like we don't do all of the things that could be bringing us closer and creating more intimacy.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was finally one of the things that I heard clearly from my wife was her saying, look, when we argue, even if it's raised voices or even if we're both very, very angry, there's an intimacy that comes from that. And she said, I feel very, very close to you. If we can have a big argument and then you stay with me, I love you all the more, right?
Yeah,
and so it's a very counterintuitive but beautiful kind of dynamic. Offering generosity. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So I think there's kind of all of the things that I see as building friendships that really fall under pro-social behavior, which is anything that you do to benefit another person is going to create connection. And so generosity is, anything that you can do to show another person love is going to make you both feel more connected to each other. And part of that is, I talk about this too in the chapter on affection. There's this theory called risk regulation theory. And that indicates that we are all kind of very afraid of rejection, and we decide how much to invest in a relationship based on our view of how likely we are to get rejected. And so anything that we do to show people we're not going to reject them, whether that's through my act of generosity, showing you that I want to connect with you, or my acts of affection, those basically make other people feel more secure so that they can then engage in all the acts of intimacy with us.
What would be some practical ways to do some of that?
Well, the first thing I do is just think about something you love and then ask yourself how you can share it with someone. So maybe that's baking or cooking, or I like amassing information. So I would give my friends PowerPoints on like Roquefort on hosting parties, hosting dinner parties. But the other thing that's really important when it comes to generosity is like anxiously attached people are often generous because they feel like there's going to be repercussions if they're not. And it comes from a fearful place.
Huh.
And that actually is more likely to burn us out. And it makes them also more likely to sacrifice and give in a way that's not actually sustainable. And I would also ask that the initial act of generosity should start with a pause. Do I want to do this? Is this aligned with the resources that I have, the time that I have? And so we may feel like that might make us selfish sometimes, that we can't be generous all the time. But in fact, it's going to create more sustainable generosity. It's going to make us less resentful towards other people. It's not going to make us withdraw the same way as if we overextend ourselves. Because in the research, it's called unmitigated givers. And they're not doing as well as these mitigated givers who are generous, but also are thinking of themselves. I talk in that chapter about mutuality, which is like, if you take a step back and look at the other person's needs alongside of your own, which are more urgent in this moment.
Mutuality and mitigated givers. Yeah, so that is calling into question a sort of idealized sacrificial self.
Yes.
And insisting upon prudence as a part of our generosity.
Yes. It is. I think the more we take care of ourselves, the more capacity we have to take care of our relationships. And it's an act of authenticity, right? And authenticity is enlivening. It is energizing. It's what makes our relationships more rewarding. And so bringing authenticity, generosity by giving things that you like, or by making sure you're giving because you want to, rather than just because you're afraid of repercussions. That's just, we want quality relationships at the end of the day. It's going to make you happy. It's not going to make you burnt out, resentful.
And it's a classic example of love your neighbor as you love yourself, that I can't love my neighbor very well if I haven't learned to love myself very well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Giving affection.
Yeah,
the last
affection.
practice.
Similar generosity is just like a powerful tool for creating connection because of risk regulation theory. I'll say something that I learned about affection while writing the chapter. I have a friend who's really bad at taking compliments. I love affection. I'm a writer. I love to tell you in an artistic fashion just how much I like you. Interesting verbs and stuff. Rock your world. But she gets really uncomfortable, and I can tell. And so I said to her, you can't reject this affection when I shared it. So I asked this researcher who studies affection, Corey Floyd, hey, what's going wrong here? Why doesn't she accept my affection? How do I get her to accept my affection? I said, what you're doing is not affectionate. Affection has 3 components. You like someone, so it's not schmoozy or fake. You express it and they receive it. If they're not receiving it, it's not an act of affection. And I was like, oh, like that actually makes sense to me, because if they're not actually feeling loved, then how is that an act of affection? It's more about me if I'm trying to sort of force them into it. So I think when it comes to affection, it's really important to be able to adjust our affection to how other people receive affection from us. The other thing that I'll say is these acts of generosity and affection, it can feel like, for some of them, like this is time consuming. I don't have a lot of time. So something I tell people is to remember to provide these in what I call diagnostic moments. And those are moments that we use to diagnose the overall health of the friendship. And diagnostic moments tend to occur in moments of high emotion, when we're feeling really bad or really good. How does our friend show up for us? So I just got a promotion. Is my friend like, I got to take you out to celebrate? Or are they like, I can't believe they gave it to you, right? Or I've been really depressed. I'm caretaking for a parent. Is our friend, hey, is there like a day that I can take over? Or here, I'm going to send you some food so you don't have to worry about it. Versus, they just kind of pull away in those moments. And so if you're someone who's really busy, just remember, if your friend is going through a diagnostic moment, you don't have to be generous all the time, but at least, or affectionate even all the time, but at least in those moments, they're going to matter so much more how you show up in them.
So as we move toward a close, a couple of questions. One, the story that you tell about Abraham Lincoln and a friend of his, I found very moving. But would you kind of share some of that with us?
Yeah. So I was reading up on Abraham Lincoln and his friend Josh Speed, and they did things like share a bed. Lincoln kind of had a psychotic episode, and Joshua Speed was like there for him the entire time. Lincoln would take Josh on trips together. And, some historians think that it might have been homoerotic, but when you look at the larger context at the time, that those behaviors that we might consider more romantic now were part of platonic intimacy. There was just a lot more closeness. Friends would go on a honeymoon, their friend's honeymoon together, like write their names into trees with hearts around them, cuddle with each
Huh.
other. This was all not weird or strange. What changed was that in 1867, um, how we define sexuality shifted. Before then, it was like, don't have sex with someone of the same sex, but sexuality wasn't an identity. And then Richard von Krafft-Ebing, the psychiatrist, and Sigmund Freud, they basically created this theory that sexuality is an identity so that they could then stigmatize that identity as something gone wrong for a person. And in doing so, now it wasn't you just have sex with someone that's stigmatized. Well, you could still cuddle with them and write them love letters and, share a bed with them. That's not weird. But then it was sort of like now an identity is so much more abstract. So all of these behaviors are now seen as romantic. And then friendships, particularly men's friendships, got a lot less close, a lot less intimate, and a lot less affectionate because of something called homohysteria, which is the fear of being perceived as gay, that
Mm.
straight men often have too. So they're not able to, you know, say I love you or go out of their way to do something really kind. Or I think some men can even be afraid of like initiating a new friendship with a new
Mm.
guy that, oh, how is this going to be taken or seen?
Yeah, fascinating. Um, as you've worked through all of this research, what are some of the key things you've seen change in your own life?
Um, well, teaching this class now, I think like I see my students and they're just like, "Oh, like you're kind of a loser if you're lonely."
Mm.
And I'm just like, "Well, the average person is lonely, so are we just all losers here?" And, like, also, like, there's this stigma. I think our society is so avoidant about friendship, like, we're anxious about romance, but avoidant about friendship. So it feels, like, so easy to be, like, too much in friendship, and I'm just like, "What is wrong with being the one that loves that loves more?" Like, that's actually a beautiful thing if more people were like that, like, that would be so great. And so I think we have just internalized all of these harmful messages about wanting connection, being lonely, being upfront with that about ourselves when like we are fundamentally social creatures. Like it's okay that you really want friends. It's okay that, you're willing to go out of your way to love people. Like I think doing this and even in my own friends, I think there are ways that I felt afraid to express the intimacy that I felt towards them.
Hmm.
But on my friend's last birthday, I was like, "You are my soulmate. I hope you know that. Like we were meant to do this life together."
Hmm.
And so I have freed myself up to try to release some of those messages, and I'm still working on it. And instead try to attune to how do I actually feel about my friend. And Raina Cohen, she has this great book, Other Significant Others, and she talks about like how people can have friends as platonic life partners. And one things that she says is that when you meet a new person, instead of imposing you're a friend to me and now let's do all the things that friends do, like go to happy hour once a month, what if I were to viscerally experience the relationship and based on the dynamic decide the direction that I would want it to go? Like we really connect and I want to see you often, whether that's within the realm of friendship or not. And so for me, writing about friendship, understanding it more deeply has allowed me to break out of this very limiting kind of anti-human cast that we
Hmm.
put platonic love in.
Hmm. So imagine a listener saying, "Okay, I'm convinced, but life is busy, and I am have to deal with my own anxieties." What sort of encouragement or first step or practical advice would you give to close?
Mm, I'm busy. There's a lot. Okay. I would probably give them some like low hanging fruit, which is reaching out to someone who you've lost touch with to reconnect. And you can just share a memory. I was just thinking about that time we did this, this, and this. And I just wanted to see how you're doing. And if the vibes are good, say, oh, I would love to reconnect. Like, it's been a while. I'm so sad we've fallen out of touch. Like, would you be open to doing this, this, and this? The other thing I'd say is like, if there's friendships you have, you can create a new friendship within those friendships. And so if the initiating part is too scary, could you create a new friendship within an old friendship by bringing generosity, by bringing affection, by writing this friend a card to say how much you mean to them, by going out of your way to get their favorite snack or food and offering it to them, right? And so can you create more acts of connection within your existing connections? But the last thing I'd like to leave people with, because my niece, she read Platonic, and I think she was very wise when she said this, which is that just for friendship to happen, someone has to be brave. So be brave.
Yeah, that's a lovely place for us to end. Been talking to Professor Marisa G. Franco, author of the New York Times bestseller Platonic, How the Science of Attachment Can Help You Make and Keep Friends. Marisa, thanks so much for your great book, and thanks for the great conversation today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.